Ayo, this is Book Blog by Caitlin Dalton. This comic is a bit of a remix on Casper the Friendly Ghost. If I had to say, I'd guess he was commenting on this story. Of course, the premise of Casper is that a lonely, misunderstood preteen girl meets the ghost of a boy her own age, and they become fast friends and get up to shenanigans. Eventually, he helps her fit in at school. The protagonist of Anya's Ghost by Vera Broskell, Anya, has similar problems. She's struggling to fit in, she's insecure about her body, and the hunky basketball player doesn't notice her. However, Anya is managing to fit in quite well. If she lives on celery, she can eventually get her love handles off. If she pretends her last name is Brown instead of Boriskovskaya, the basketball player might notice her. And if she disowns herself of her Russian heritage, she might manage to fit in. You see, Anya is a first-generation immigrant from Russia. She struggled as a young girl and as an ESL student, and worked very hard to lose her accent and any other trace of the culture that defined her as being different. When she stumbles upon her very own friendly ghost, a 9-year-old teenager named Emily, who was murdered in 1918 after losing her fiancé in the war, Anya is at first horrified. However, Anya quickly discovers that her ghastly friend could be helpful when navigating high school. Emily herself takes to modern American culture and is enthusiastic about helping Anya fit in. This becomes more sinister as Emily starts being more controlling. She convinces Anya to attend a party in revealing clothing so that she can tempt her basketball cutie. Even after Anya discovers that the boy is cheating on his current girlfriend and propositions Anya to a threesome, Emily still insists that Anya should pursue this boy, because it's true love, right guys? It is around then that Anya tries to research Emily's murder, thinking that if she can find the killer, Emily can move on. It is then that she discovers Emily's dark secrets, and the lengths Emily went to in her own attempts to fit in. The feelings Anya has to resolve in order to help Emily move on are in fact more complex and sinister. The truth that she discovers is that Emily's problems are not far from her own, and she is forced to reevaluate how important fitting in is to her. This is an excellent comic that disrupts assumptions made about adolescence, and this comic shows that problems that might seem trivial in some lights actually have some pretty devastating long-term effects on self-identification, and some serious judgment calls about identity formation, including the relationship identity has to culture. Lexile score isn't really relevant to comics. The sentence structure of this text is simple, but the bulk of the complexity in this story is in the illustrations. See here how Anya's assimilation is characterized in her high school. In the first panel, she is obviously in the forefront. In the second, when she is further into high school, she is not an immediate focus. This highlights the way in which in school in this text is a means of stripping identity down and forcing assimilation on students. However, while the themes in this text are complex, I think they're better suited somewhere between 8th and 9th grade. While it is grappling with some larger cultural issues, the crux of the story lies in the problem of losing identity through fitting in at school. And that's really something that I think should be grappled with more in the younger grades, although it's still applicable to the older grades. I think this would be a challenging text for them, and would really push them to think more abstractly about identity than they have before. While I think the central theme of a unit based around this book would be identity formation, I think it is absolutely essential to spend at least a day teaching kids how to read comics, as it's a medium they probably are not familiar with. I would definitely assign excerpts on Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which is an awesome text that explores how authors use gutters and pictorial vocabularies, as well as a lot of other things, to convey meaning in comics. I'll probably assign a few smaller comics initially in conjunction with this to practice on, maybe like Sunday strips from Calvin and Hobbes, or abbreviated sections of Alan Moore's The Dark Knight Rises, just to help them learn how to grapple with these skills. I might have them write a comics essay for their summative assessments, or maybe have an option of a video essay. I prompt them to respond to themes dealing with identity in the text, and I explain how citations work in these formats, and I show them examples of how comics essays work. However, I think it would be really useful for them to learn how to practice using these techniques, because I think that would really help them understand how these techniques work when you're reading a comic. This is an awesome text to teach, and I love the idea of using comics in the classroom. They are a new and exciting medium, and there are so many complex texts that could help shape groundbreaking units. However, when people are teaching comics, it's important to keep in mind that it is a different medium. If a kid has read books before, you don't assume that they know how to read poetry. Scaffolding must be inserted. I also think it is important to teach comics because we need to validate kids who might be good at reading but aren't good at reading traditional novels. The skills needed for these two different mediums are completely different, just as poetry and reading novels would be different. The skills needed for these two different mediums are completely different, and a student who is better at reading comics is not necessarily The skills needed for these two different mediums are completely different, and a student who is better at reading comics is not necessarily the inferior reader at all. However, because there is a hierarchy in literature that puts novels above comics and a lot of other forms of literature, they are often not taken seriously. I'd like to finish on a different note. It has probably caught some people's notice I have been using the word comic as opposed to graphic novel. I will explain why. Comics used to be read prolifically, until around the 1950s when they became taboo and comic burnings were a common practice. Eventually, superhero comics in particular gained popularity over time. But there is also an underground group of artists who insisted on validating their medium by writing heavy literature in the form of comics. The breakaway success from this movement was, of course, Art Spiegelman, who wrote the groundbreaking work Mouse, published in 1986, which is regarded by many as a classic. The term graphic novel was invented for this book after it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, because they needed something to call it. What do you call a comic that is important? Spiegelman accepted the award with a grain of salt. While he was glad his work was met with positive regard, he received that acclaim with a slap in the face to his medium. Claiming that some texts are graphic novels, while other texts are comics, just adds another level to the hierarchy of literature. In the end, this hierarchy does little more than validate teenagers who want to read something other than James Joyce, because let's be real here, nobody really wants to read James Joyce. I'm sorry, maybe like one person in the entire country wants to read James Joyce. But there are texts in the world that probably aren't very good. But I do not believe it is the teacher's job to decide which texts are good and which aren't. I definitely don't believe in condemning an entire medium.